energy part of it. And third, the safety aspect. The local community has to accept a nuclear power plant. And I don't think there are a lot of communities that are open to that. As far as coal and natural gas go, even the most ambitious plan to transition away from fossil fuels, right now, Colorado runs 60% of our energy use or so comes from coal. And even the most ambitious plan says that in the next 10 or 20 years, the most we can reduce that to is about 40%. So we're going to be dependent on coal for a long time. But we have to ramp up our use of renewable energy, solar and wind power as well. During that time frame, we need to switch to natural gas. But we do have to run our economy on clean American-made energy. And third of all, trade. I think our economy, as I said, runs on people, energy, and trade. And our country doesn't export enough. The president has set a goal of doubling our exports in the next 5 years. I think that's a lofty goal, an ambitious goal. We may not reach it. But it hits the point that we have to export more. Here in the 6th District in our community, we're next to last in the state in exports, and we don't export hardly anything at all. We need to export goods and services, not necessarily outside the country, but outside the state. Right now, our district and our community is too dependent on population growth and government spending. Over in Aurora, they are almost completely dependent on the spending that's generated from the Buckley Air Force Base and from the VA facilities over there and population growth. Here in Douglas County, for many years, we were completely dependent on increased taxes, completely dependent on population growth and construction spending. And that has to end. That's not sustainable. We don't have the water for it. So we have to transition away from that and start exporting, not necessarily goods. Obviously, Douglas County isn't going to become a big manufacturing base, but we have to export services and build these clusters like they do in other communities. We have the entity over on the eastern side of Douglas County, CH2M Hill, which is one of the biggest engineering firms in the country. And they export services all over the world. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about to bring money into Douglas County in terms of trade. Over in Jefferson County is a good contrast, because in the northern part of Jefferson County, outside our district, they're in the forefront of this new energy economy, not just in our state, but in the whole country. They have the advantages of having NREL there, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and CU Boulder. And those clusters of companies that have come in around that have put them in the forefront of the nation in that effort. We need that sort of effort in the southern part of Jefferson County and throughout our district that, again, exports goods and services outside the district. And I think if we did that in every district across the country, we'd solve some of the problems we face with our budget. Which brings me to the biggest problem we have. Long term, I think the biggest threat to our economy and to our country is the deficit. And I think to address the deficit, first of all, we have to go through the major portions of the federal budget. Number one, DOD. Two is healthcare, discretionary spending, subsidies, and other tax breaks. And lastly, the key, of course, is economic growth. So we have to look at all of the spending, starting at the top. In the DOD, we have to reduce war spending. And by bringing our troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan, not only is it the right thing to do, but of course it saves an incredible amount of money. Same with the nuclear program. The biggest threat to our country, regardless of what you're talking about, is the nuclear threat. And of course, by reducing the number of nuclear weapons in the world in our nuclear stockpile, not only, again, is it the right thing to do, but it saves an awful lot of money. Our acquisition program in the military could be much more mainstream, mainstreamed quite a bit. We waste an awful lot of money. There's tons of examples. I was in naval aviation. For instance, the Navy stockpiles parts that they haven't used in 10, 15 years. There's examples of that sort of waste all across the services, and we don't need to go into it now. But there's an awful lot of savings that can take place in the Department of Defense. The healthcare reform bill, a lot of that was to save money. The biggest portion of medical spending where we can save money is in Medicare. And the idea was to save $500 billion over the next decade through the healthcare reform bill. Is that going to happen? We sure hope so, because we have to reduce the amount of medical spending that we have in our country to balance the budget. The president has frozen discretionary spending. That's the right step to take. But we also have to eliminate subsidies that don't serve the country or the community. Those sorts of subsidies, for instance, to certain parts of agriculture, need to be ended. So we need to take a good look at all of those subsidies. And again, and then from there, taking a look at our whole tax system. I think we need to look at the mortgage deduction, we need to look at the status of nonprofits, all sorts of things that we haven't looked at to save money in the discretionary portion and how we tax different entities. And lastly, economic growth. I sort of covered that before. By investing in people, energy, and trade, we will eventually have economic growth, which provides a bigger tax base, and those are the portions, the things I think in order that we can do to eventually balance our budget, which again I think is the biggest threat to our country in the long term. So that's what I think the election is about this year. Addressing the debt, but first of all, ending those wars responsibly and creating jobs here in the district. And those are some of the ideas that I would present to you and put forth once I was elected to Congress. So I stop there and open it up to questions rather than me just standing here talking to you. At you, I should say. Does anybody have any questions?
In order to trade, in order to trade, don't we have to have some industry?
Well, we can, as I said, we can export. Germany's a good example, but of exporting goods. They're the biggest exporter in the world right now, and they specialize in different high-tech goods. We have seeds of that right here next to our district. This exporting of energy-related products, biotech-related products, computers, high-tech products we can export and make all throughout basically the area just inside of 470, basically from the tech center heading west. But exporting services is just as important, and that's why I referred to CH2M Hill and all of these engineering companies that, for instance, that could cluster around CH2M Hill and export these services and bring money back into our district and into our community. Does that answer your question?
Helpful.
What's that?
It's helpful.
Okay.
What can be done about the difficulties in Republicans and Democrats getting along enough to face the problems in Washington? I'm very tired of hearing how big the battles are and how nobody will talk with each other.
Did everybody hear the question? It's this idea of common ground. I hope I hit it a little bit in a general way in the video. But again, it's walking the walk. I mean, I'm a Democrat, but I served in the Marine Corps for over 20 years. I've been around conservatives my whole life. In the airline business, most of the people I work with are conservatives. I've talked with them and worked with them for the last 19 years. And in terms of walking the walk in this political campaign, in the first 6 months of this campaign, I went out to the normal Democratic supporting groups over and over. I've been running for 18 months. But for the last year, I've spent most of my time outside the office with conservative groups and business groups, Kiwanis, Rotary, and Chambers of Commerce. There's over 12 chambers in our district. I've gone to those chambers over and over and over again, made presentations to them, and 3 of them asked me to join, the biggest ones asked me to join their chambers. And so I go to them, that's where I spend my time, talking to them, learning what they think needs to be done for small and medium-sized businesses. And that's what I do repeatedly, 2 or 3 times a day, some days during the week, so at least 4 or 5 times. That's where I spend my time now, with groups that look at me and say, you know, what are you doing here? Well, I'm trying to represent all of the people.